The Metroid Prime series has a rather fervent following. Just mentioning a new game in development or a deviation on the horizon is quick to stir up cries of joy or outrage. Whatever the tone though, that passion is driven by an appreciation for the franchise's prime reputation going back to the days of the GameCube. Since the series' debut, there hasn't been an installment that I haven't enjoyed, but I can agree with those who claim the finest entries are among Retro Studios' Metroid Prime Trilogy. Which game in that collection could be considered the best though? To put them all on a level playing field, I think it'd be appropriate to review them as they were represented in the standalone Metroid Prime Trilogy released for the Wii. Although there's nothing wrong with the first and second on the GameCube, the Wii renditions enhanced them with the third game's control scheme, and it's hard to look back. Aiming with the Wii remote in place of the GameCube's left control stick is a smoother experience and more precise overall. It feels like the right kind of configuration for a first-person shooter, which I think is a safe assertion with games like Splatoon incorporating optional motion to bolster aim. There's only one notable shortcoming with the Wii remote as an input device. When held as a pointer with games like Metroid Prime, the 2 button is a little cumbersome to click. Fortunately, it's set to the inventory screen in the first 2 games and a mission overview in the third. Nothing you'll need to review in the heat of battle in either case. Between the original GameCube games and the Wii release, I've watched through each entry plenty of times and played through the first game on multiple occasions. The long leave of absence from the series prior to Metroid Prime Federation Force had me returning with plenty of fond nostalgia, but even after taking my rose-tinted glasses off to take a more critical look, it's clear that the game's aged well. Every entry in the mainline series is brimming with atmosphere, and the Prime games carry on that tradition with confidence. In the franchise as a whole, I actually don't think any managed to capture the feeling of isolation quite like the first Metroid Prime. Wandering the Chozo ruins and reading about their lost civilization really sets a scene of solitude. The trilogy handled loading in a diegetic fashion too, whether through doors opening when the next room is being rendered out, or through transition sequences like elevators and portals. The games maintain a persistent world that makes for quite an immersive experience. The worlds themselves were also thoughtfully assembled with environmental storytelling in mind, putting together a gallery for players to review by way of derelict architecture and abandoned outposts. There's plenty of practical guides integrated into the environments too. Wires feeding power into rooms, for example, highlight small morph ball routes that would otherwise be difficult to notice. The transition to 3D made the world more complex since they were no longer restricted to 4 directions, but the map screen evolved to facilitate the Z-axis and serves as an accessible and manageable point of reference. If you're not interested in taking advantage of it though, your mental map can be reinforced through backtracking, a practice that could be considered a staple of the series. The rooms across the trilogy are distinct and stand out from one another, making it easy to learn the layouts and find your bearings on return trips. The demand for backtracking is stretched to its limits in the second game though, thanks to the variations presented by its parallel worlds. On one hand, you can learn the layout much better when there's 2 versions to explore, but on the other, the odds of treks feeling tedious is heightened, especially among players less fond about revisiting familiar territory. What helps to alleviate any repetition though is another series mainstay, incremental upgrades. You gradually gain new abilities as the adventure presses on, which offers new ways to interact with the environment while also expanding your reach within it. The first 2 installments start Samus off with a sizable suite of abilities that players will swiftly lose and need to regather. How many are available at the onset relative to how many are lost scales between games, and those missing items return to your inventory earlier in the second compared to the first. This is definitely a smart approach since it doesn't deprive players of their expectations for long before building them up better than ever. Level design between the 3 games goes through an evolution of its own based on how these loadouts are issued too. Take Samus' space jump boots for example. They made their debut modestly deep into the first game, but they were available to the player from the onset in the second. They're lost following the close of what you could call the game's tutorial, but are reclaimed earlier than they're found in its predecessor. In the third game though, they're at the player's disposal from the start and are never lost since that gear-losing trope doesn't return. How the game explores verticality shifts with the availability of those boots. More of the world is designed knowing that the player's height is restricted for some time in the first game, while the third game knows players can reach higher elevations right away and encourages them to take advantage of their skill set. This was also a good move since the novelty of new abilities would wear off between releases. Having a double jump was fresh in the first game and could warrant a late reveal, but players would come to view it as a standard by the third outing and expect to have it up front. Anything less would feel like a step backwards. Samus' beams saw an evolution throughout the trilogy too. In Metroid Prime and Echoes, you'd be able to actively swap between weapons and choose whichever one suited a situation. Echoes didn't deviate far from that formula, but introduced ammunition to the proceedings, encouraging players to plan their shots more thoughtfully. Corruption did away with beam management and incrementally improved Samus' firepower. Instead of reserving an input for switching weapons, Hyper Mode took its place, offering a buff to beams and other abilities at the cost of health. It took management from a laid-back, stakeless choice to a dynamic and demanding juggling act that could have negative ramifications if mishandled. Energy tanks were also easier to find in the third game, which was no doubt by design since this new state put a greater demand on health than its predecessors. Hyper Mode wasn't the only change that augmented the action though. The grapple beam saw more practical functions by the third installment. Beyond just swinging and shooting, it could be utilized as a lasso to pull debris from the environment or peel defenses off of adversaries with a flick of the nunchuck. Much like aiming, this method was an immersive and welcome addition to the controls. But there were other gestures that left some fans less than impressed. Many weren't a problem and made for neat little novelties, but a few could prove a bit cumbersome or even frustrating if you didn't approach them right. Twisting and pushing hatches in particular is something I can't defend myself. Sometimes the sequence will be satisfying to perform, but if you don't get a good feel for the motions, the experience will just come across as a clunky inconvenience. Certainly nothing game-breaking, but an unfortunate blemish on an otherwise spotless feature set. Although all three games have a lot of variety in their environments, the scope amplifies with each installment. The first game saw players exploring the diverse landscapes of Talon 4, while the second cast them on Aether and its dark dimensional counterpart, and the third allowed the player to travel between Brio, Noria, and Elysia and the pirate homeworld. Speaking of pirates, those starfaring subordinates saw a redesign in each entry in the trilogy, arguably for the better, although the first ones are by no means bad. Graphically, the games are pretty on par with one another, and they all still look great today despite their resolution capped at standard definition. Since there was a generational jump between the second and third game though, there's a bit of a sharper sheen on the third installment. Subtle elements like blue highlights radiating from a power beam's charge inch it up to the top. As you'd expect, the series expanded its narrative with each subsequent entry. There was also a bit of a tone shift between games, which I think can be appreciated since the developers were actively avoiding stagnation and raising the bar on what they could pull off between projects. The trilogy became less isolated between entries and steered into a more goal-oriented direction. While the first game set you on the surface of Talon 4 alone, the second introduced Umos, the Sentinel of the Luminoth, who would offer guidance by way of text, and the third had a cast of hunters and NPCs with spoken dialogue. But if you're like me and have a compulsion to look for lore, the series' standout feature is the scan visor. When active, the player can lock on to different objects and enemies to review text about them, and there's plenty to be said about everything if you're willing to read it. The first game used orange and red icons to denote scan points, with the former representing standard information and the latter being critical mission data. The information you could pull was entertaining throughout the series, but it wasn't until Echoes where the system really shined. Instead of small icons, the second game made the entire scannable object holographically shaded and much easier to spot at a glance. There were also subcategories given to every notable log, allowing progress to be tracked on multiple levels. It was all a bit excessive for anyone other than Mythos Meisters though, so they scaled it back with the third game while preserving its presentation. The log's text blocks were also traded in for a scrolling system, which was definitely an upgrade since it offers players more control over the pacing, but designated chunks still have their charm. The Metroid Prime trilogy is quite a collection. The first game made a massive splash when it first launched and set a super high standard that retro studios would have to enforce. So when it came time to tackle a sequel, the developers didn't rest on their laurels and experimented with the formula to make sure the project lived up to their past work. Some consider it to be the weakest entry in the trilogy, citing its departures and difficulty, but it was still lauded and labeled as a critical and commercial success. The team continued to experiment and brought action to the forefront when they developed the third installment, but they didn't forget where they started and stayed true to the series' strengths throughout. There was less isolation, but the atmosphere and platforming remained at the heart of the experience, bolstered by a controller that seemed designed for first-person projects. It's not a stretch to say it's one of the best trilogies in the industry today. You really can't go wrong with any of them. I think the first game has the most memorable environments, the second has the most interesting world, and the third is the most fun to play. If I had to make a choice though, I'd say Metroid Prime 3 Corruption takes the top slot for being the natural evolution of the series' mechanics, structure, and storytelling. But the first game is a really close second. That's just my opinion though, so let's pass the question off to you. Which Metroid Prime game do you think is best? Vote using the card above or share your opinion in the comments below. Whatever you decide though, I think we can all agree that the original trilogy is still in its prime.